polio was the worst. That you were really quarantined. Everybody was.
Contracted polio back in 1944. My folks and I, my sister, had, everyone was scared of the epidemic. They didn't want to be around the county fairs, everything like that. People were scared to go.
A disease that was almost unheard of in the 19th century soon became one of the deadliest and most feared diseases in the history of the United States. Originally called infantile paralysis, poliomyelitis, or polio for short, was a disease that attacked anyone and everyone. In the early decades of the 20th century and leading into the 1950s, summer epidemics swept through town after town. The results were devastating and the scientific community had little to show for it. In an effort to impede its spread, communities and health boards resorted to century-old quarantine and isolation tactics. These quarantines brought up important questions about the rights of an infected person and the responsibility they held to the community and people around them. The first major polio outbreak in the United States was recorded in the summer of 1894 in the small town of Rutland, Vermont. This is known thanks to the descriptive work of Charles Caverly, who was a local doctor during the time of the outbreaks. Overall, 130 people contracted polio, with at least 20 dying from immediate complications. The next major polio epidemic struck the United States in New York City. In 1907 alone, over 2,500 people were killed by infantile paralysis. Attempting to curb these numbers, research facilities such as the Rockefeller Institute opened their doors. This institute's first director was Simon Flexner, who worked persistently to determine the causes of polio. Although promising, these efforts produced no cure. The New York Times, May 8, 1910. With the discovery of the cause of infantile paralysis, of its peculiar process, and of the method of treating it, the disease is all but conquered. But as many Americans would soon find out, this was not the case.
Contagious, and it was devastating. And it struck different people differently. Sometimes it would affect the legs, and those people wouldn't then have to be put into an iron lung. It was those that couldn't breathe, and it affected their lungs.
In our house, it was like 3 steps at the landing, and then more steps at the landing, and then down. I made it to the first landing, and that's the last thing I remember for at least a day. The hospitals were crowded at that time with polio patients. They didn't have a lot of space for them. And so I had to, I was at home, and it was a small town, 900 people, whatever. And the doctor said, well, hey, we might as well just keep me here.
Overall, people knew very little about what polio was or how to treat it. It was this, combined with the random attacks, that made polio so feared. We know today that polio is an acute, viral, infectious disease that spreads from person to person. But in the early 20th century, this unknown fact resulted in widespread panic and fear. As polio cases increased, so did the call to stop its spread. Cities and health boards began using draconian measures to stop this frightening disease. The full brutality of polio was yet to come. In the summer of 1916, there was a total of 27,000 reported cases and over 8,000 deaths across the country. New York City was once again hit the worst, with more than 9,000 cases and almost 3,000 deaths. As the summer progressed, polio spread farther and wider. People in affected cities such as New York began evacuating their homes and traveling to the country. Public health officials began to worry that these movements would help spread the disease. July 4th, 1916. The Department of Health banned all children from the movies and the paralysis war. Public celebrations were canceled, and the police department enforced these measures. Behind these decisions was the New York City Health Board. one of the leading boards in the country. The man in charge of this group was Haven Emerson. In order to gain public support, Emerson had 500,000 pamphlets printed to warn people of the dangers of polio. Within days, similar announcements were made. The New York Times read, "Children under 16 have been barred not only from moving picture shows, but from all the amusements at Coney Island except those in the open air. 16 playground streets were closed today, and the opening of 39 more were delayed. The children's room in the public libraries and all playground sandlots were closed. Oil will be sprinkled on the surface of the park playgrounds to make them as dustless as possible." Hoping to further decrease these spreading numbers, the mayor of New York, John Mitchell, issued a citywide cleanup with crews working around the clock to clean the streets. They removed all refuse and rounded up all stray animals such as cats and dogs. Despite these new enforcements and laws, polio cases were still on the rise. By July 25th, almost 3,000 new cases had been reported, and over 600 had died in New York City alone. At this point, Emerson and the Health Board decided to enact new travel requirements that restricted travel for any child under the age of 16. The inspection of children leaving the city for interstate travel will be compulsory from now on, and all railroad and steamship lines have been notified to that effect. Ticket punchers at station and pier gates will be instructed not to pass any children who have tickets for points in other states unless the children show the federal certificate.
I started feeling really rough. Temperature, all sorts of things. And a fellow the doctor was an expert at taking spinal fluid. He came out to the house, and I remember my dad held me, and this guy tapped in against the fluid. It hurt my lasers, of course. And they put me back in bed. And an hour and a half later, the guy called and said, "There's blood in the sample. I can't use it." Back out he comes. Well, that happened 3 times. And so anyway, they finally got the sample, and it was polio. So I stayed home, and the doctor came. They didn't really know what to treat polio for at the time. And I was quarantined in the house, big yellow sign on the front door. And the doctor actually came every 4 hours, and he gave me a shot of penicillin, which I felt like a pincushion after a while.
Polio was a major issue in everyday life. The infected and death tallies received their own section on the front page of the newspaper. All infected people were immediately listed and published for all to know in the paper. If your child, or yourself, did receive polio, he or she must be immediately quarantined. Oftentimes, children were forcibly separated from their family and loved ones for weeks or even months. Once the diagnosis was verified, a health official would nail a bright quarantine card to the door of the household. They checked on a daily basis to make sure that they were kept up and enforced. If not, people were fined the equivalent of thousands of dollars. These situations brought up important questions of who has the authority to do such things. These insane and often described as draconian laws violated any sense of personal rights. They put into question the health responsibilities of an infected person and the rights that he or she will therefore receive. As the summer of 1916 came to an end, so did the number of polio cases. Polio would return to the United States summer after summer for the following decades. However, no summer was quite as horrifying as the summer of 1916. People were restricted, isolated, and violated. Learning from their mistakes in this summer, governments and health boards developed new procedures to combat polio. It was not until the 1952 Salk polio vaccine that polio would fully be eradicated from the United States.